The sword. All right, the sword. Come on up. And all right, there you go. You should be good.
I have a couple questions. So you said earlier that you were a corporatist. I'm, if I remember correct.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Well, my question is, why do you prefer corporatism over something like distributism, which I'm sympathetic to, or capitalism, which I do support because I'm a Hoppian, you know?
I don't think that many of the distributist thinkers like Hilaire Belloc or Chesterton were actually really opposed to corporatism. In fact, where they saw it implemented, they oftentimes praised that economic system and said it was pretty good. I see distributism, even though I think corporate, and I haven't studied them in depth just to give context, but I think any discrepancy between the two systems is really sort of a minor discrepancy, not a true spiritual difference. Whereas something like capitalism or unbridled capitalism, I'm certainly supportive of like free enterprise. Like if you want to start a business and you're, the small business owner, why not? That's great. That's something that St. John Paul II spoke to during his time as Pope. But what I'm against is the sort of usurious system of capitalism we currently live under, right? Where people are given loans and credit card debt and, sort of living in a debt-based economy where they can never pay it back. They really become debt slaves. Everything is centered around consumerism as the end-all be-all and the almighty dollar rather than the people that it should be serving. And I think that's my ultimate problem with what I would call unbridled capitalism. Capitalism as an understanding of, I exchange goods and services for a price is not bad. When you bring it down to its most reduced level, I guess you could say. But when it's, again, this sort of unbridled state that we find in many neoliberal societies and in the neoliberal West, I think it's reached its zenith and we've seen the kind of horrible effects that it creates. Now, I think it's much better than, say, like maybe the Soviet system or what have you, but better is not best, in my opinion. And I think there's still much work to be done.
All right. I mean, if I may push back a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So I tend to think that capitalism is great if you, because I don't think the system we're under is capitalism. It's a corporatocracy, if you want to be like really autistic about it, right? Where I actually think the government should not, get in the company's way. Also should not be doing the bidding of the company. So like they should have to, be like compete in a fair and free market. I also think that Christians, this is why I support freedom of association. Christians should, under a freedom of association model, start their own communities and, ban usury. Therefore, if you remove the usury from the capitalism and you have it resemble like how American capitalism was at its founding, you could probably have a way better system.
I think the problem, so there's some agreement I have there, but I think the problem, and this is something that made me abandon libertarianism primarily, was this trust in, well, capitalism is just going to sort it all out. I mean, when you see a company like Amazon kind of have the unbridled power that it currently does, I don't think that the answer to it is like less government control. I think the answer is, ironically, with a company like Amazon, more regulation, right? Where they have been given sort of a lot of power to be able to just have unbridled control over our economy and even our politics and the way our society operates, to the point where they start to form social habits, the way we interact with other people, and even just how every facet of life functions, right? Whereas if we have enough government control in the right way, I think it can prevent monopolies like that from taking hold and really I think affecting a society where we almost get kind of the same railroad baron type fights we saw in like the 1800s, right? Where railroad barons could like bankroll politicians. They could, basically have their way with the society any way they wanted it to be. But their altruism of being white Anglo-Saxon Protestants kind of prevented them from going the full sort of sociopathic way we see more with like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos. Because we don't even have that WASP culture anymore, somebody like Jeff Bezos or someone like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel is one of the first people that comes to mind, can pretty much do whatever they want in a completely unbridled way and use sort of libertarianism as a cover for treating our society like their sandbox. And even though Christians, you can say on paper that Christians might have sort of the freedom of association, in a practical way, if you don't have the like material means of affecting that, that's just kind of something on paper. I mean, we see this, for instance, with I would argue we see this currently in our society, and I think you and I would both agree our society as it currently stands is not ideal. But look at like what Averil's community is doing, right? Averil's not hurting anybody. He's not discriminating against anybody. He bought private land to set up this white advocacy community, and he's still getting harassed by the state. He's still getting harassed by corporations and all these kinds of entities that make it impossible for him to live the way he lives. Now, I know in probably more of your system, the state would have less power to do that. But if corporations can basically do the same thing where it's like, hey, Amazon controls the water, they're going to shut the water off if you have this like white advocate or Christian advocating community. We're not going to have the material means to get like water or food or anything like that. And so I think for me, I think my kind of system, just to finish, and then I'll totally let you talk, brother, is ironically, I kind of agree with the libertarian, but in a way of I don't want corporations or the government or any of these entities to kind of have the sole means of power. I want it to be distributed enough so that they can't really lead to any kind of persecution of Christians.
All right. How I would respond is what I think could be done is we could basically have it to where basically like the Homestead Act, right? So let's say you're like a rich guy, you own like 50 mansions, right? Because I don't know, you're that kind of guy.
Right.
Well, and let's say 49 of them have not been used for like, let's say 10 years. And let's say, or let's say private forest hasn't been used or something like that. I'm saying people would be able to homestead that property and, make use of it how they want. So, and another thing is, without the government helping out the corporations, right? That would probably solve it. Also, we wouldn't really have a problem with politicians because if we have to have a state, which I'm an ANCAP, I kind of oppose that. But if we have to have one, then I would prefer a monarchist, minarchist thing. So like classical liberalism, but monarchy.
So, I think there's some ideas to kind of work with there. But something I would argue with that like Homestead Act example is who would enforce that act, right? That would still be the government, because, if someone walked into one of the, 50 mansions that this guy uses but doesn't operate or doesn't actually like live in, right? Or I said owns but doesn't actually live in them or use them or anything like that. Well, you would still need an entity outside of that individual to enforce such an act, and that would be the government. And I think that this is kind of the argument from power that I see. I know his name's already come up, and it came up during the Jubilee thing. Carl Schmitt, right? Talks about where there's always going to be power in a society. There's always going to be someone sitting on the throne. And I think that in order to engage in politics, we have to accept that. We have to accept there's always going to be someone holding the reins of power. Now, is the question, does that person have my interest at heart? Do I agree with that person or do I not agree with that person? And I think when we ask that question, we start to engage in real politics where I want my guy holding the reins of power. I want the entity or the person that I agree with and that has my vision of how things should be, ruled or run or what have you to hold the power. And I almost see, in my opinion, and not to be insulting, my friend, but libertarianism kind of denying the existence of that power and thus becoming sort of a victim of not seeing the political reality we live under.
All right. Well, one thing I would say is, if you want government power, right, we would, have a monarchy. Like if we really needed a state. But I'm kind of I kind of admire David Friedman, where he talked about rights enforcement agencies, basically, where it's kind of like a Netflix subscription. You pay a certain amount, and then they kind of protect you, and like you basically get like a legal. Also, you have like unbiased judges, so like you're not gonna have one centralized corrupt legal system. There's going to be like multiple different courts, So let's say Judge Ralph is, taking all the billionaire money, but then you have Judge, Sarah taking no money basically, and basically is a unbiased judge, right? And then you would have the defendant and I don't know what the person who accuses is called again. I'm kind of fuzzy today.
I'm trying to think too, man. It's okay. We've been going for a while, so it's hard to remember some terms, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like they would each have their own like rights enforcement agencies, and the agencies would negotiate, and if the negotiations didn't go well, like basically if they couldn't come to a settlement, then they would settle it with an unbiased judge, and they would like decide on the court to use. You would have it like that. But if let's say you think anarchism is too extreme, like if you think, I obviously don't think we could go to like ANCAP like today. I'm not crazy like that, because you need to remove the illegals and stuff like that for libertarianism to work, because Fuentes said himself that libertarianism can only work in a WASP society. But I do think you could have like a type of classical liberal monarchy where you have like a Christian who has like more classical liberal values. As like and then you could slowly have it turn to like ANCAP. So.
No, I understand where you're coming from. I mean, and I hope I'm not being aggressive or insulting and saying any of this. So if I ever do, please call me out. But the example of like rights agencies or multiple courts, I mean, in my opinion, that just sounds like government with extra steps, because the issue that I think I started to contemplate more, and I was looking up the word for it, but again, Schmidt kind of talks about this, but it's an older trend actually from like, I believe Juan Donoso Cortez, and then it's gonna kill me, Damast, Joseph Damast, right? This older kind of trend in politics, more reactionary type thinkers, right? Where sovereignty for a state has to come from somewhere. Like power comes from somewhere, and we have to ask whose power and who's enforcing it and who controls power, right? So, to have like multiple courts that are kind of all doing different things is to really just kind of like, in some ways, kind of decentralize the state. But what you get is just instead multiple different states, right? And in that absence of sort of an overall unifying state, I feel as if what the political situation that's kind of created by something like anarcho-capitalism really is it kind of creates a like, and I don't mean this as like kind of hyperbolic, but like a Mad Max type world where it's like the strongest individual winds up winning out. And because the strongest individual winds up winning out, it kind of overall negates the overall political project you were trying to create in the first place. Because you might retort that with saying, well, there would be like a mutual pact to ensure that no one gains that kind of power. But again, who enforces that pact, right? Would there be some oversight committee? Okay, well, if there's some oversight committee or some power higher than that enforces that overall pact, that's still a state. And in some ways, you still get back to sort of like the root not so much the root problem, but back to originally what a guy like myself is saying, where you're always going to have this kind of overarching state that exists. And I think that's okay to accept. And the question becomes not so much how do we undermine that state? That's just always going to exist. That's the state of man. Man is a political animal, as Aristotle says, right? The question then becomes, what kind of government do you want, right? The state exists, but what kind of government do you want? And I think that's the question that ultimately made me give up libertarianism, because I just didn't see a sufficient answer from the libertarians. And it seemed like they were kind of always getting back to that same question, but with either extra steps or trying to avoid it altogether.
All right. I mean, first, I would recommend the if you don't want to read the book, at least look at the summary of the book, Machinery of Freedom. Just search summary of Machinery of Freedom.
Oh, dude, I'd totally love to check it out and stuff like that. Maybe I'm wrong in my assumptions, honestly.
All right. So, basically, the problem, if someone wants, let's say you have some communist that, I guess is a hypocrite, he owns like an agency and he wants to like create a centralized communist state. The problem he has is everything's going to be decentralized. So, also it's kind of like this society would kind of be like Vinny wannabe tyrant kind of rose up, he wouldn't really like where that went, but also you could I was going to say that also I do recognize the rights enforcement agency thing as a government. I don't have an issue with governments. I have an issue with states. So the state is basically an involuntary way of having law and order, and I want it to be, by an individual's choice. For example, I would kind of live under an Orthodox model. You would live under a Catholic model, and I want us both to kind of have what we want and win in the end, instead of, trying to overpower the other in a way.
I think, though, the problem becomes essentially that, you touched on it almost like right there, right? Where it's this, sorry, someone in my chat said the corduroy shirt that I was wearing was sexy. This guy's been cracking me up all night. Yeah, dude, he's so funny. He's like, when we were talking about the water earlier, he's like, we may no longer have any water, but we'll still have sap. And he was like making all these like sap, I don't even know what you call him. I'm so tired, but it was funny. I love that guy. Anyway, back to the question. It's kind of funny. I think in some ways, by man's very nature, governments just kind of are involuntary because, and I think this gets back to, it's been so long since I've been in like a humanities class or like liberal arts class, but I believe Thomas Hobbes talks about this in sort of the nature of how politics is, where it's the social contract, right? Like even when you're born into a certain society, right? You're kind of inherited into the certain society. Now you can try and change the society you're born into or what have you, but you're born into it nonetheless. And I think rather than denying that you're born into it, like, kind of those sovereign citizen type dudes you see the body cam footage of where they're like, you can't arrest me, I'm a sovereign citizen.
I hate those guys.
Oh yeah, they're annoying. And I know you hate them too. I'm not using them to misrepresent your position, but it's like, those guys may think, well, I'm voluntarily engaging society, but it's like by your very nature of being a man, right? And man being a political animal, there really just is no choice. You could choose to live in a different society. You could immigrate, you could emigrate, you could go to a different place. But at the end of the day, you will always be living under some kind of government, unless you literally lived out in like the middle of maybe the Gobi Desert or what have you, right? And at which point you're completely isolated from the rest of society. So if you live in society, you're naturally a participant in politics, and the state is a manifestation of really the society that you live in. And it's not really by its nature something that is voluntary, because it's kind of involuntary for human beings to organize in a society, because it's really just our nature. And so I think by accepting that nature, state and government really become one. But at that point, you can engage with the question of the state in an honest way of, okay, well, the state exists. We've accepted this is the political nature of man. So what kind of state do we want? What kind of society do we want, right? And at that point, I think you can kind of engage in an honest discussion of how the state would be manifested and the steps to kind of get to what state you want, rather than denying its wholesale existence, if that makes sense.
I suppose, however, right? When I say voluntary government, I mean like contractual. For example, I will see the church as a government. Now, we would agree that the church doesn't come to your house, right, and force you to convert like it's in a Sharia country. No, you walk into the church and you choose to convert within your own free will. Likewise, when you have a when you work a job, you are agreeing to the authority of your employer, or say the insurance company you have. When you sign a contract, making a deal, it's like, okay, I live under these rules as long as I'm with the company, right? As long as I'm with the insurance. That would be an example of a voluntary government. I'm just saying I want to expand that to where people could have, like, basically the rules people live under would be voluntary. But I do think that I'm not like a live and let live guy. I do think there should be social consequences for stuff too.
Absolutely. Well, and I don't interpret you for an instant as a live and let live guy. I know very well that you're not, and I know that libertarians do have a better conception of law and governance than a lot of people give them credit for. But I still think that the problem comes down to, for instance, you cited like the church. Well, even though I voluntarily choose to be baptized, or I voluntarily choose to be confirmed and be a part of the church, I still live under God's sovereignty, whether I accept it or not. Every man does. I believe it's Holy Scripture says, the sun still shines on both the wicked and the righteous, right? And that's God's providence overall. So, in an involuntary way, I'm still under God's providence, and in that way, I'm still in very much a practical way under the sort of sovereignty of the state, so to speak. Even though I didn't make a voluntary compact with the state like I would with an employer, or I would with the church necessarily, right? For a man to not be under the sovereignty of the state, he would have to live outside of that, and that would mean physically living outside of that. However, the problem is that that's not practical on sort of a mass scale. If you look at any society on a mass scale, I agree, like, for instance, with your criticism of not capitalism, communism, where it's like they're trying to centralize everything and some things just literally can't be. But I don't think as an overcorrection, we then deny the existence of a state. I think really the correction is understanding where the state does rule, and asking ourselves, in that ruling of the state, how can we get ourselves to a position where we have the best state of affairs, right? Where the state is ruling justly, where it's showing our interest rather than the interest of somebody opposed to us, and operating within politics that way. Because it's just within man's nature, right? If I associate in a society, I'm necessarily a part of a state, whether I like to be or not. And if I don't want to be a part of the state, I would have to voluntarily leave that society, but that would place me in isolation. I just don't think that's practical on a mass scale. Oh. Oh, heck yeah. Okay, you're still here.
I guess to wrap up, because DK does want to wrap up, but I will say that what do you call it? That basically, oh right, Christian proprietarianism. I was looking at my notes I had on my phone of Christian proprietarianism. Sorry. So Christian proprietarianism, to finish this off, is based on the idea that everything in the universe is homesteaded by God, because without him constantly maintaining it and all that, he would, the universe wouldn't exist. So basically, he's the homesteader of the universe. Therefore, if you decide to not follow his rules, right? If you decide you're gonna go and you rebel and you end up, in hell, right? Well, the thing is, it's his property, you're his property, so it's kind of like that, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like you're in a you're in, like, it's his private property, so you're in a contract with him, I guess. But they do want us to wrap it up, so
That's totally fine.
I guess if you want to, you could add me as a friend. We could, I guess, go deeper in this conversation sometime.
Yeah,
You're
dude,
an awesome
I'd
dude.
absolutely
I'm a
love
big
to.
fan.
It was a delight to speak to you, bro,
Yeah,
and you were super respectful and wonderful to speak to. So thank you so much for coming on.
That's thanks to my father. Also, I've been looking for your social media ever since that one thing on Jubilee, because I found you kind of funny on there. Glad you're finally in here, because I was looking for you.
Oh, I appreciate it, man.
God bless.
I'm on YouTube, Pinesap, Feels Guy 2003 on.
I found your YouTube from the server. So
sick.
I already
Okay.
subscribed.
Heck yeah, dude. I'm glad to have you as a subscriber, man. We'd love to have you be a part of the community.
Thank you.
Alrighty. God bless you, bro. I'll talk to you later, okay?
God bless.
Awesome. Thank you, Sword. I appreciate that. All right, let's see. We are all right, a few more questions left. All right, it looks like we have about 5 more people raising their hands. Do you just want to get through these ones real quick?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's